Welcome back to My Trauma's Chronic, but I'm Iconic, where we embark on a journey of exploration into the realms of diversity, inclusion, and innovation. I'm Me, and together we delve into thought-provoking discussions that challenge the status quo and celebrate the richness of diverse perspectives. In today's episode, we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Annemarie, a trailblazer in the field of neurodiversity. Dr. Annemarie, a former teacher turned trainer and advocate, brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. As a neurodivergent individual herself, she has dedicated a career to championing inclusive environments and empowering others to embrace their differences. Join us as we delve into Dr. Annemarie's insights, exploring the importance of inclusivity in education and beyond, and uncovering the keys to fostering innovation through embracing diversity. Get ready for an inspiring conversation that will challenge your perspective and ignite passion for creating a more inclusive world. Welcome, Dr. Annemarie, and welcome to our listeners as we embark on this enlightening journey together. Can you share with us your journey into becoming an advocate for neurodiversity and inclusive environments in education and the workplace?
Yeah. So my journey really started way back when I began my teacher training. So in 2003, and it was by chance, to be honest. So in 2003, I started my PGCE in further education. And I had been late diagnosed at the age of 26. I was a mature student at university, and they went straight on to do my PGCE. And when I was at university, I got I'd been assessed, and I got support on the disability student allowance. And I used to have some reasonable adjustments in place. I used to put like these little stickers on my essays to make lecturers aware. So when I started my PGCE, I just assumed that support would continue. And so I went to see the supported learning person at the college and university where I was to ask about support, and they were like, we don't really have any support in place for trainee teachers. And so that kind of like sparks my interest, and myself, and there was another neurodivergent teacher who's dyslexic. So I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic. They were dyslexic, and we made a decision to try and put a case towards the I think it was the academic panel or something along those lines. The academic panel, I think, was to ask about why there wasn't reasonable adjustments in place for when you were doing the practical elements. So I still got student support, disability support for, in terms of the theory, but there was nothing put in place. So there was no consideration about I might need additional time to prepare my lessons, that I might need just some kind of consideration and thought when you were doing lesson observations or any of those things. And so we actually got together, we put a case forward, and then we were told it would not be fair. So it was just that idea of that, instead of thinking about it in terms of equity, they were thinking about it in terms of equality, that not all trainee teachers would get the same thing, but our point is they weren't all starting from the same point as us. So that then sparked my interest. And for I had to do a dissertation, and it was a very small scale. It's only 7,000 words as part of my final assessment for my PGCE. And I decided to look at dyslexic teachers in the classroom. And I did some observations of dyslexic and non-dyslexic teachers just to see what was the difference in the classroom. And what was interesting is that dyslexic teachers tended to come prepared in terms of they had additional props, like they might have a glossary, or they were so much more aware of what they might do and how they taught. They tended to be more creative in their delivery. So that sparked my interest when I was doing my PGCE. Then I started teaching, and when I was doing that piece of research looking at dyslexic teachers in the classroom, there was a piece of research that had come out in 2003 by Barbara Ruddock from Sunderland University, and that was looking at training teachers in the compulsory sector, and in the fact that they didn't have any support. And some of the stories in that, because it was a qualitative piece of research where teachers were talking about their experiences, basically deterred me from declaring that I was dyslexic when I started my first teaching role. And I think it wasn't until about 2-3 years in that I decided to declare. And then one of the college where I was working, there was an opportunity to do an MA in education. And then at the final part of that, I got to do an MA dissertation, which was 10,000 words. I think it was 10 or 15, I can't remember now. I looked at a case study of one college and how it supported its the language that was used at the time was very much from the biomedical model, so it's teachers with specific learning differences. It's not that the neurodiversity approaches and movement hadn't started then, but that wasn't filtering into the academic research, certainly not around education. So I looked at teachers with specific learning differences, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and how middle, seniors and line managers would support them. And again, I found it echoed my own experience that I didn't actually get any support. On request, I was told that what do you need, and I'd be given, I remember asking if I could have some, because I had an overhead projector and I used to have acetates to be able to prepare my lessons in advance. And I asked if I could be in a classroom where there was ILT, so technology, and then again I was told that wasn't fair on all teachers if I was in the same, if I had a classroom where it had that and they weren't able to have access to IT. So that then sparked that piece of research, and what came out of that was that although there was a will from these line managers and these senior managers, they didn't really know what to do. And so in the absence of that, they didn't do anything. And all the onus was on the individual to, that you would have to declare. But there was no systems really put in place to support anyone once they declared. And it just didn't feel like a safe space to declare either. So from that, I then I took voluntary redundancy and from my teaching job, and then I taught for a year in another sixth form. And then my supervisor for my master's kept saying to me, you need to put this into a PhD. So I started the PhD, and that's then while I was doing the PhD, which was looking at how the policy process, so education policy, who decides on it, and how that can have particular implications for, again, the language was lent from the biomedical model, so how what implications would it have for teachers with specific learning differences. So in that one I looked at wider, so I interviewed not only senior leadership and teaching and learning and equality managers and line managers in FE colleges, but also I reached out to the wider membership organisations and unions to do with teaching, to ask them about, the policy process and, was there any thought in the creation of it and the implementation about neurodivergent teachers. And what I found, again, there was a will from people to want to support, but there wasn't anything there. And a lot of the time they were cribbing, they were just taking from the support that was in place for students and were saying, on that basis, we will then, if a teacher declares, we will do something. So it was very much onus on the teacher. And a process that's set up for students is not adequate for an adult, and it's certainly not an adult professional. If you've got your professional integrity, you don't want to, you've got all that kind of psychological well-being that needs looking after. So from the back of that, so it's been a real journey. When I finished the PhD, I thought I could carry on in academia, writing lots of articles, which I have wrote, and then, that would be open to the academic community and anyone else who wanted to read it or critique it. But I was like, do you know what? I want to do something. I need to do something tangible with this. I need to do something. So that's where the kind of advocacy work started. And I set up my business, Neurodivergent Insider, to try and work with schools and colleges and other wider organisations to help them, plan neurodiverse policy that was neuro-inclusive, and in terms of getting them to think about how they could be a bit more neuro-affirming in their practice. And then the kind of advocacy work took off when I joined LinkedIn, because I was able to connect with other like-minded people, such as yourself. And then that was a great opportunity, because then from that, I came across two brilliant people who, one is an ADHD certified coach, and the other is a neurodivergent teacher. And they already had an idea. They were doing a pilot on a support group for neurodivergent educational professionals, and so I reached out, and so from that point we then set up the support group for neurodivergent educators, which is in our 6th month now, and it's really grown. And what it shows, even though it's only a microcosm of, we have about anything between 6 and 15 people joining the session. It's once a month. And we've also set up a kind of WhatsApp support group as well, as part of that. And there's a real need for it. So that's the kind of very long explanation of the journey. But I think it's like anything. It's not an overnight thing. You don't just wake up one day and go, right, I'm going to be an advocate. It's partly my own influence, going right back to when I was at school, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 26. So I went through the whole of my education, the whole of my life. I suppose feeling I didn't quite fit in, and not really understanding why. And I knew I thought differently to other people. And so that's why it's been a real journey. But otherwise, I'll stop there, because I'm sure you've got other questions that I've answered already in that big, long explanation. But anyway.
No, it's just really fascinating for me to listen to it, because it seems like it's been quite an eventful journey.
Yes. Yeah.
To say the least. What I want to touch upon is the support group that you've just discussed about. Yeah. What made you think, okay, I want to collaborate with this ADHD certified coach and a neurodivergent teacher for this initiative?
Because, do you know, when I set up the Neurodivergent Insider, I thought, okay, so what I want to do is actually, if we get the organisations to think about neuro-inclusion, so the growing body of research looking at the subjective experiences of neurodivergent teachers, so teachers who are dyslexic, dyspraxic, ADHDers, who might have PTSD. So there's a growing body of research on that. However, when the focus was on that, I felt that it wasn't appreciating the wider context. So that's why I set up that. And when I set that up, that was my focus. And then when I saw this poster for neurodivergent support group for teachers, I was like, oh my God, yeah, absolutely. In the absence of that being set up, because that's a utopian idea that, it's a utopia at the moment, but we want it to be a reality. We need to have the support element there for teachers. And if schools and colleges and the education sector are not going to do it, it has to be a grassroots. So when I saw this, and I reached out so it's, I'm sure they won't mind me. So it's Beth Thomas and Annie Campbell, and they're brilliant. So when I reached out to them, it was Annie Campbell who had been in discussion with Beth about, I don't think there's anything out there for neurodivergent teachers. And Beth was like, well, let's set one up. And then I saw the post, and I was like, it's like, like serendipity, like it was meant to be, like happened to be on LinkedIn at that time, saw this poster, got in touch with Beth. We had a conversation. then I met with Annie, and I just loved them. They were both brilliant, and there was so much energy. And so from that, we came across the idea. We didn't know it was going to, if it was anything in it. In our first session, I think we had like 21 people attended in our first, and it was brilliant. And then the numbers do fluctuate. But that's just the very nature of teaching as well. Not that teaching fluctuates, but just in terms of people and having time, because, like any profession, they're time poor. And we run it on a Thursday, the third Thursday of every month. Just for this month, though, it's going to be the fourth Thursday. And it's an hour and a half, and it starts at 8:00. So the idea is with that, we would see how it went. It's still evolving because it's only in its 6th month. But it's one, I think there was definitely a need for just a space for decompression. As a neurodivergent teachers go, oh, bloody hell, there's more than me out there who's feeling like this. And also and what we do is we set it up as a lot of the sessions. The last session we had was during Neurodiversity Week, and that was more of a kind of decompression session where people were talking about their experiences. But normally we do it as an information session. So we deliver a part presentation, and we've done something on the Equality Act, we've done something on neurodiversity, we've done something on in terms of what were the other things that we've done it on? Ableism. We've looked at ableism, imposter syndrome, all of those things. So we started off with something to provoke discussion. So there's the reason it was partly serendipity, partly absolute need, and to then do it in the round of having that focus on the wider workforce, but also in the interim, there needs to be something there to support neurodivergent teachers. And I really struggle with the word support. A lot of the time I try not to use it, but that's what is needed at the moment. My issue with the word support is that it's always associated with a deficit, like you need to prop someone up. Now, this situation has created, these individuals themselves wouldn't need support if we had a more neuro-affirming society, really, not even just in education.
Yeah, definitely. I think also it's the thing about fluctuating needs and capacity. I feel like they're two different things, but and then because people do not, once they're known for something, or like I had 3 people that support me every single day. They follow me out everywhere, but nobody would know that until I mentioned it, or until they see me with 3 lots of people every single time. But there has to be, oh, well, she doesn't have capacity. She like you said, needs to be propped up. But people forget about the strengths that this person has.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, but I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, but people like, in your earlier stages of doing your PCG, when you are asking for like reasonable adjustment, people would question your capacity for being a teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's like, but this has nothing to do with my capacity to fulfill a role in education. Yeah. It has to do with me being able to support the children above and beyond.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's something that I feel like neurotypicals and some neurodivergents people fail to understand.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point. We can't just assume as well that because the kind of the way, we'll talk, I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but just the fact that the biomedical model and the pathology paradigm is so dominant in our society. And I would say, myself, for a certain, very early on when I was diagnosed, I completely denied it, and I would not accept that I was dyslexic, dyspraxic. For me, it used to really anger me, the idea that I was, and I would want to, if I could, had it taken away, if that was possible. And that is only because my experience of education, when it became clear the reason why I struggled was because I had really poor GCSEs when I left school. I didn't leave. The fact that I've ended up with a PhD is pure determination and endurance, which neurodivergent people all the time having like tenfold because we've had to, you know, like that's purely down to my determination and no one else. But my experience of education, and so I thought at the beginning when I was first diagnosed, if that had been taken away, my journey for education would have been easier. And that's the wrong way to look at it. My journey for education would have been easier if education sector in any way recognised anything other than a one-size-fits-all way of looking at something, you know. So you're right. So it's not just those who are neuronormative. There are other people who are neurodivergent who don't necessarily would, yeah, like you said, would see that that the issue is external. You know, it's not them. So I think, yeah, that's all really important.
I feel like it's like, I feel like, you know, dyslexia, any sort of ADHD, autism, they all have negative connotations to it. And it's like, to whether it's people within, you know, the group of neurodivergents or outsiders. And it's like, you know, neurodivergence is not a weakness, nor is it a superpower. It's just a way that we are and the way our brain is built.
Yeah.
And it's really just remarkable to see different perspectives when you meet new people, whether it's professionals, colleagues, friends, acquaintances. Just find it really true. Yeah. How has the group evolved over the past 6 months since its inception?
Yeah, so the group has evolved in the fact that we have a greater range from the education sector. So originally, the idea was, I think, around neurodivergent teachers, but there are, you know, there are other roles in education, you know, such as teaching assistants. There may be technicians that work in education, you know, lab technicians, that sort of thing, and academics. So we've also evolved in the fact that we have representation from, you know, we've got those who work in education, in the education sector, that are from primary schools, are from secondary schools, are from further education, are from higher education. And that's really interesting because it's only a microcosm, granted, but you get to see the whole experience in the fact of through the range of education. And all of these sectors are funded differently. But what the commonality is that they're all finding that they are not being recognised as, you know, as you know, that there's a neurodivergent workforce. And the thing about education is that it should be a bastion for neuro inclusion, because at the heart of it should be, you know, equality, diversity and inclusion. And there are things put in place for students, albeit a lot of the time they're put in place so that they can process in a neuronormative way, granted. So you would think, well, if we put all of these things in place for students, then the assumption would be that they'd grow up and they might want to be teachers, they might want to be lawyers, they might want to be doctors. So the how the group's evolved in terms of that, so we've got a representation from education sector as a whole. We have opened it up, but it's just the timing as well. But that it can be for international. So when you're talking about things like, so international educators, so if you're talking about things like feeling like you have to put resilience strategies or feeling imposter syndrome or ableism, that's a universal, you know, that's an international thing as well. So we have opened it up. We haven't had anyone from the international audience yet, but that would be great. And it's evolved in the fact that we've tried different models in the way that we've done it. So as I said, we've done like a presentation. We've done where we have changed the format in terms of, we've done a little bit of presentation, then myself and Annie, we kind of almost like tag team the discussion. And then the last session we did was just a very much opportunity for decompression. That was more of a discussion. So it's evolved in that way. And from it, what we realised is that once a month for an hour and a half is just not adequate. It's all that we can do because we have all different commitments. So we then set up a WhatsApp group for people to join. Now they had to sign terms and conditions and everything like that, because some, obviously can imagine when people are talking about decompression, talking about any stresses, that's all got to be protected. So we set up a WhatsApp group as well. And that's quite useful, because what we'll do in that is that we'll set up times for body doubling. So, if someone's got to get, some marking done, or, we have some PhD students as well. If a PhD student's like, I just can't get started, then we will, through that, organise some body doubling where we'll have been 2 or 3 people on at the same time, and we work together, which is great, because you don't always get an opportunity to do something like that. And we, also has the opportunity to share if someone sees an interesting article or something, and then we'll share that on the WhatsApp group. So we wanted to put something else to recognise that support needs to continue, but that's as much as we can do in that time.
For those listeners who don't know what body doubling is,
yeah, sure.
How would you describe it in a simple way for them to understand?
Yeah, so body doubling is very similar to, it can vary in how it's done, but it's a kind of almost like mentoring, buddying up with someone. So how it normally works is that you would agree a time that you're going to be online together, and normally you go on, you both, or 2 or 3, whoever's going to be on it, so you might do it through Zoom, and you set some intentions about what you're going to do, and then everyone gets on with their tasks. You normally have your screen on but your audio off, and then you can decide whether you want to have check-in points after an hour, depending on how long it is, or after a half hour, after 20 minutes. And then at the end of the session, whatever you've agreed, you would then, talk about what you've done. Yeah, so it's almost like a very soft accountability. So it's not like, oh, you haven't done it, why haven't you done it? No one questions each other, but it gives you that opportunity to be focused, the opportunity that someone else is there. And so it's just a great opportunity. It's a really nice a neuro-inclusive thing that you can do with others, in which you recognise that, well, actually, unless I have a specific time and I know there's some accountability with someone there, I may, get distracted with something else. So it's very good. So that's what all body doubling is. It can vary, because there's not, it's not one objective way of doing it. So, but that's generally what it is.
It's still in very early stages, but have you seen any positive outcomes resulting from the support group sessions?
Yes. So we have had, so there've been anecdotally, so the members who are part of it, and when I say members, they don't have to sign up to any membership or anything like that. People can come in and out. We're very much aware of that, and we do say that even in the sessions, don't ever feel you have to stay for an hour and a half. But what we've known is that anecdotally, we've had feedback to say that actually, if they didn't have, if they didn't have this, they wouldn't know what they would do. We have had people who've felt confident, so that's really important. So I mentioned declaring. There's never any pressure on anyone to declare about anything, or raise anything through reasonable adjustments. No one should ever feel any pressure to even have those conversations. But on the back of us having that safe space, there are members who have actually asked for reasonable adjustments, or have put boundaries in place in terms of things like, we know that there are a couple of people who do I can't think of the technical term. It's basically cover teaching, and they've actually said, you know, that's the word, supply teaching. Supply teaching, and they have told the agencies, please do not contact me on the morning, because it gives me anxiety. If you haven't booked me the night before, I don't want you to contact me on the morning. So they put those boundaries where they would never have done that before. So that's great that they felt confident. There's never any pressure to anyone to do anything. But so they're really subtle. They're not massive. They are massive wins, actually. I'm going to take that back. They're massive wins, because it means that someone is feeling empowered, someone's feeling, and they're making that decision, you know. And then I think if it gives people confidence and a check-in, then it's been great. They're the things that have come out of it. And through it, which is something that, and this is a great thing about LinkedIn, I had Simon Preston, I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning, who contacted me about neurodiversity in education, which is a community interest group that community interest company that I'm now director of as well. So there's lots of things positive that have come out of it, with the intention of doing much better things in terms of raising awareness about neurodiversity in education. But I'll stay there. I'll stop it there, because I know you're going to ask me about that later. Is there anything else about the group that you wanted to?
I only have one more question. What plans or aspirations do you have for the future growth and development of neurodivergent educators group, or people to do with education? And how do you envision the support group contributing to the broader conversation around neurodiversity in education settings?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how we see it evolving is, the ideal would be that this would be initially replicated, you know, so there's only so much the three of us can do, but this would be replicated and become a model initially as a way of supporting neurodivergent teachers, but then evolve into something in which neurodivergent teachers would have something in which they could share ideas and share good practice from where they're working, and all of those different things. So I said already that I don't like the word of support. And one of the things is, if you keep having things in place for support, when does it become part of, you know? So if we keep just saying, okay, the idea is in the future we just have networks of support everywhere, I think it in some way removes the responsibility from the education sector as a whole to do something fundamental themselves about. Having neurodiversity firming set up in terms of policy of practice, recruitment, all of those things, because outside is supporting neurodivergent teachers. I mean, we want to get to a point. The idea is initially we might have networks of it, and then they might be hubs of sharing good ideas and collaboration. That would be brilliant, because then it becomes more positive, rather than it's a positive space. But I think you get what I'm saying in terms of, at the moment, we're needing to be there because these teachers are massively struggling, and not because they can't cope, but it's because the environments that they're in. And then almost like this, the group could evolve, and you might then be able to get from the group a network of teachers that could go into schools and colleges and go rounds and be able to assist in, creating this neurodiversity affirming culture for all, for learners and the workforce. So that's the idea. And the kind of wider neurodiversity in education. So that community interest company was set up by Simon Preston, and the idea. So there's three directors: myself, Rachel Owner, who has an education background, and neurodivergent. So all three of us are neurodivergent. We've all worked in education, so we have that context experience. And the idea is we're in the process of creating this kind of one-stop shop almost, where it doesn't matter what sector of education, that you would come to us and we could help you do, planning in terms of policy. This would be for HR, this would be in education, this would be for, line managers, this would be for principals. So the idea is we create this one-stop shop where they could come and we could guide them in terms of policy and practice around every element, even in terms of designing the year plan, all of those sort of things. And so the idea is with that neurodiversity in education, that the support group would be connected to that. And then through that, we might be able to get a greater coverage. You might be able to have around the country replicating this support group on different days, because we only do it on a Thursday once a month. We might be able to, if we got enough people involved, might be able to have one every single day of the week. And if it's online, it doesn't matter where it is in the country, it just makes us more accessible, we were just saying before we kind of started that you could get yourself to the level of burnout where you go, well, this is not enough, I could do one every day of the week, but you can't do that and then do everything else. So so that's the idea, that part of that bigger piece, that we would potentially have a network of that initially in the guise of support, then moving into more collaboration space, more creative space. That's where I'd like us to go.
How do you define neurodiversity, and what aspects of it are particularly relevant in educational and training contexts?
Yeah. So neurodiversity for me, I very much so neurodiversity as a to do with the as a biological fact includes all kinds of neurological diversity. So I'm very much I'm reading more up about and getting more familiar with the kind of neurodiversity movement and the neurodiversity paradigm approaches that have been shaped from the biological fact that there is no such thing as normal in terms of neurofunctioning. There's all possibility. So when I talk about neurodiversity, I lend from that in terms of not only talking about things related to some of the more common neurotypes when people talk about neurodiversity, when they're talking about dyslexia, dyspraxia, when they, in terms of ADHD, autism. I also consider, things such as comes under that umbrella would be, this is not a definitive list, but to give you an example, like epilepsy, PTSD, because it appreciates that kind of wider. And where I lend from the neurodiversity paradigm, and particularly, I'm almost, quoting here Dr. Nick Walker's work on the paradigm, where she talks about the difference between, if you're talking about someone who's got epilepsy and you've got someone, so for example, my sister developed epilepsy at a late stage, so when she was 40. So she comes under neurodiversity, I come under that neurodiversity, but then even neuronormative would come under the neurodiversity as a biological fact. But my neurodivergent is pervasive to me in the fact that if you gave me like her medication to try and take my dyslexia or dyspraxia away, you remove me. If you take my sister's, if you ask my sister, could we take your epilepsy away? She would say yes, because it wouldn't fundamentally change who she is in terms of everything that she is, if that makes sense. And that's the different, and I like that explanation between looking at it in terms of, and that's not to say in any way that if someone chooses that, say, for example, if they have ADHD and they want to take, and they choose that they want to take medication, and that makes in order for them to like navigate in the world and do what they want to do better, then that's totally up to, you know, it's totally up to them. So not against, as long as it's not trying to, that people think and feeling that they need to take it and it takes their essence away, and it's about making them neuronormative. So I'm very much in the kind of neurodiversity paradigm approach in terms of that. So which means then if we have the biological fact that neurodiversity covers the diversity of minds, and then the acknowledging and respecting the neurodiversity movement that came about in, I think it was the early 1990s, partly from a community online, mainly of made up of autistic people, a community. I think it was there was a community called Independent Living, and that was shared by, you know, academics, scholars, writers, and from that, then trying to create another way of looking at dyslexia and dyspraxia. So the movement was like, let's stop being othered with the biomedical language of, you know, condition and disorder, and that these individuals need fixing. And so that's where the language, as you're probably familiar of neurodivergent came about. And that's really, and the reason why I identify as a neurodivergent is because as a movement, it's a social justice movement. And when I say that, I feel like I'm making a statement, almost like a social justice political statement, that I am not. I don't want to be othered. I don't want to be seen as that I need fixing. You know, in terms of the biomedical model and the pathology paradigm, that I have to do something to fix myself in order to be able to. So that's where I very much learned from the movement then, and it was the movement that developed the kind of neurodiversity paradigm and approaches, which then obviously have to have language to try and explain it. So neurodivergence, the state of being, how that manifests, and the difference between neurodivergent when you're talking about an individual and neurodiverse when you're talking about a population. And just being true to so I'm trying to be very true to the original neurodiversity movement, but that's not to say that the neurodiversity approaches. There's a piece of an article by Patrick O'Dwyer that recent, not related, that came out, I think in 2022, 23, I think it is, which appreciates that, like any paradigm or any approach, it's not unified. So there are different approaches to it, but one thing that they have in common is whatever any things that are put in place for the individual must be of their choosing, and it shouldn't be to make them neuronormative or be able to operate in a neuronormative way. So it's about not taking the fundamental part about them. That's what I understand in terms of the kind of commonality in terms of the approach, but I'm still learning. So I'm not going to say I'm an expert on the movement and the because I came late to it, if I'm honest. So through my PhD, there was I came across the term neurodiversity and I was really interested in it, but none of the academic articles around looking at dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism in education use the language of neurodiversity, looked at the neurodiversity in terms of using the neurodiversity paradigm or approach language. I never ever saw Dr. Nick Walker's work or Savasi. Is it Ralph Savasi? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct. I think there was some acknowledgement of Judy Singer, but even then there wasn't loads. So I've come to it later, but that's kind of my focus. It feels natural to me that way, rather than kind of the pathology paradigm. So that's and I'm very much of the school in which it's really important that we don't conflate between the neurodiversity approach. stroke paradigm and the pathology paradigm by conflating the language and saying things like neurodivergent conditions. There's two different paradigms, and we can't confuse them, because once you say it's a condition, that means that you're using the language of the pathology paradigm, and then you're missing the whole point of that. This is language and a way of explaining things that is juxtaposed. It's totally opposite to what the biomedical model is saying. So yeah, as always, a very long explanation. But that's so I'm still getting, I'm still learning. I'm going to give myself that little caveat that my understanding of it is growing, and I very much lend myself more to that. I like the idea of, I very much see it as a social justice. Everything I'm doing in terms of advocacy work is very much under the seeing it and approaching it as a social justice movement.
It's like the thing about, even though like you say that your answers are quite lengthy, it covers things in a way that is so easy to, I guess it's a teaching side of you, easy to comprehend, but so detailed, where you answer like thoughts that you might have in your head.
Yes,
like,
I do.
Exactly.
I do.
Really helpful.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, I do. I totally. I mean, I was an exhausting child. And I'm actually quite an exhausted adult sometimes, but but yes. So can I just say, one of the things I think made me such a good teacher, I'm just going to say it, there's not many things that, I don't have any imposter syndrome about my teaching at all, because I was able, it's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Minority Report, where they've got these screens and they're able to move things around and they can visualize things like a mapping. That's how my brain is. So when I was teaching, I'd be able to go, right, I might be teaching because I was a sociology teacher. So I might be talking about gender identity, but then I could pull something over here from when we looked at class identity or social inequality in the workplace, and I'd be able to quickly grab it, put it together, and I could do that on the spot. That's what I think. And because of sociology lent to it, there was actually a module that was on being synoptic, being able to link in every area of sociology. They were assessed on it. And I was really good at doing that. That was a real strength for mine, that the way my brain is like branches. That's what it's like. That I'm able to make those links quite quickly. I can't always recall them.
Yeah. I feel like this is why people, like, I think at one point, I don't know if they're still doing this, but at one point, MI6 or MI5 were looking for people, particularly with dyslexia, to work for them. It's the way that the brain works is remarkable. And the thing is, it's like, it's so crazy. Like, people can have dyslexic-like responses without having dyslexia, because a combination of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, and autism.
Yeah.
Dyslexic-like response. It's crazy.
Yeah. So what you can get, so dyslexia can be something that's innate. So mine was, or you can get acquired, which you can get acquired through, say, head trauma. There is, and what it does is it makes I don't know loads about it, but I know it then can present in that kind of dyslexic thinking. There's that whole movement called dyslexic thinking, but it escapes me now. I think Richard Branson was part of it, but there was something else. I don't want to discredit people and not give people credit for something, but now you can add that as dyslexic thinking. We've been able to see it for a little while on LinkedIn as a skill. Yeah, so I think very much, yeah. And that's why, which is a really nice point to think about, that many individuals who are diagnosed as, with a single neurotype such as dyslexia, the likelihood is it's not a single neurotype and they're multiply neurodivergent. And so I have, as I said, diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. Well, what they do is they don't even just diagnose you with those. What they said when I first got my diagnosis back in 2001, they said to me it was dyslexic in nature, which is quite a strange thing. But I think it's because I didn't quite tick all the criteria. And dyspraxia, I think, doesn't get the same recognition or acknowledgement. I don't know if what the right word is in terms of awareness. And I wasn't diagnosed with dyspraxia, or they did the official type, which is developmental coordination disorder. Is that right? DCD, yeah. Until I was 39. So when I started my PhD, even though I'd had my educational psychologist report done as a mature student, because I lost one page, the disability student allowance wouldn't accept it, or it would have been student England, whatever it was that you applied to. And so I had to get it assessed again. So that's why I was diagnosed then with DCD. I know that there is, I don't know the stats on it, but I know there is a chance that there is a correlation, or there's a high chance of, if you're dyspraxic, that you could also have ADHD. I certainly display neuro traits associated with autism and ADHD, although not formally diagnosed, but again, you don't have to be. But yes, so that's interesting as well to think about that. It's not, the likelihood is that it's gonna, you're not just going to be, I don't know, for want of a better word, it's the only way it's coming to my head, like pure dyslexic, only dyslexic. But anyway.
In what ways does neurodiversity challenge traditional notions of intelligence and learning?
Yeah, so if we think about if we think about our assessment criteria that we have, they're very much the focus on exams, the focus on, certainly with the A levels, it returned to in 2014, 2015, it returned to linear A levels. So they used to be modular. They changed, I think, in 2000 from linear, which means you used to do, and is again, you would do your 2 years and then do all your exams at the end of it. And then they introduced in 2000 that it would be modular. So you could bank your AS year. And then so you bank 50% the first year, 50% the second year. That was great for students in which the pressure in the exams to do recall. So for me, I used to get additional time in my exams. And it also enabled you to just manage that much better. Now, when it returned to linear, and that was based on the decision by Michael Gove, who was the then Secretary for Education, very much influenced by his own personal opinion. And that's what's interesting when you look at how the policy is implemented and who is the kind of one of the, who should be shaping our policy. And it's very much shaped by the personal opinions by whoever is the then Secretary for State for Education. He was very much in favour of returning to linear A levels. And that's basically what happened. So it returned to then linear A levels. So all of those students who may have benefited from having it being able to split over 2 years no longer could do that. So our assessment, we seem to have gone backwards, certainly in the A levels with that, I think, in terms of people given that opportunity. And we have to remember that all of the adjustments that are put in place for students are so that they can be assessed the same as everyone else. So it's not really embracing neurodiversity, affirming assessment in a way. And I do understand that if you think about the logistics of trying to manage, if you said, right, well, some students can do exam questions as essays and some have to do it under an exam, that there are some difficulties with that. But there has to be a better way of doing things. Now we know this because we got a little snapshot shot of it during COVID. Now I'm not, COVID was a terrible time for us all, but what it did show in terms of different ways of working, in terms of being people being able to do remote, but also that that when it came to the education, that although they did have to sit exams, it was done in a different environment. They were assessed by the teachers and the institutions that they work for. And I understand that was then, there was random samples, I think it was spot tested. And I know there can be issues with that, and I won't go into all of that now, but it did show another way of doing things. So we know there's the capacity to do it because we've done it before. And I think in terms of what we have at the moment is a system in which for learners is about, we will have differentiation in the lessons in terms of the content, how the content's delivered, but that doesn't translate into how we assess them. How we assess them is still very much shaped on neuronormative. So I used to be an examiner as well for exam boards when I was a teacher. And although you might get an acknowledgement that a student might have a little sticker, they don't obviously say their neurotype, or it doesn't say anything like that, but it does say would have got, special consideration. So when you're marking it, you still have to mark it to the mark scheme. And you only take such a small percentage off, so say if there was something like, there were some grammatical or things like that, but it's such a small percentage. So you're still kind of at a disadvantage if you have a different neurotype. So the assessment is a key thing, because we can talk about, you could have a school that's amazingly neurodiversity affirming in its practice, but then because I think ultimately Ofqual decide how things are assessed, the assessment is still that one size fits all. I think that's where it falls down. And I think there is some lessons that can be learned in terms of what happened during COVID in education, that it needs to be thought of in a more considered. There needs to be more considered. There needs to be more than, okay, well, we know that we're giving these students extra time, so that's fine then. We're giving them extra time, so that's tick. Because, and this is one of the things in kind of universal design for learning and the whole neurodiversity approaches, is about, we need to really be focusing on the individual, what the individual needs in order to help them to excel. And the problem is that even our reasonable adjustments are quite prescriptive. We give additional time. You might be able to do it online, on a computer, sorry, not online. You might be able to do it on a computer, but they're not very inclusive in terms of, they don't cover the whole spectrum of what someone might need. So I think in terms of the assessment, that's the big thing that needs to potentially change. But also in terms of just the way our days, the way everything's set up in terms of start times, finish times, just the plan of the year in education. So I've said this in terms of teachers. So a school and a college could look at their timetable, and just really simple things like, when you're planning the timetable, let's not have in the first term open days and parents' evenings and mock exams all in the same. So if you're talking about the workforce, so spread those things out. Be mindful in the timetable. We're not talking about things that are going to cost organisations lots of money. So it means about being, in your recruitment practice, in terms of how you're asking people to So what always gets me in terms of recruitment, if I'm given the personal statement and you'll be given this job description, you have to match your skill against the job description. That's too abstract for me. If you ask me, like you are now, what are your thoughts on this? Bang, 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 bang. And I'm going to hit on all those points. But if you tell me I have to do those, I'm never going to, I'm going to end up by going into descriptive. And it's not gonna be three-dimensional. It's not going to tell you anything about me. And I always do myself a disservice when it comes to the personal statement. So having a recruitment process, you know, can you send the questions to, what is the big deal with not giving candidates the questions in advance? Surely you want the best out of them. Why do you, like we did for this interview, most interviews, if you go for job applications and in education is the same. If you ask, could I have the questions in advance? That's seen a lot of the time as that you're trying to get an advantage, but it's not about, it's because you want to prepare for the best. I mean, for everyone, across, not just for those who are neurodivergent. So for everyone would benefit from that. So in terms of recruitment, so normally in teaching, you have to fill in an application form. Then on the day, it's a really long day. Just for general teaching jobs, you normally have to do an interview, a micro teach, you have to teach, then you might have to do some form of assessment. So just setting those up. So you might give, additional time in all of those activities. Try and do them so they're in the morning or the afternoon. Ask the person when are they at their best. So it may not be that it's in the morning. I've been on teaching interviews where I did my micro teach at 9 a.m. They didn't interview me till 2 o'clock. I was so fatigued by that point. So that's neuroinclusive, neuroaffirming practice. It's not it's not rocket science. Like, you can do it quite easily if you're thoughtful. And that's the whole thing about education. So my answer for that would be, we need to be much more thoughtful in how we're approaching neurodiversity affirming. And when I say neurodiversity affirming, I lend from the universal design principles, full stop, in terms of how we're setting up our environment, how we're communicating, how we're doing things. In education for teachers, it could be something along the lines of at pressure points where teachers are having to do lots of exam marking. You could say, okay, for your neurodivergent teachers, okay, well, you won't be expected to do playground duty, or you won't be expected to do after school clubs or any of that stuff. So, you can be creative. That's the great thing about if they really were neurodiversity affirming. And I think that is the key, is that what we're trying to do is then go from expecting everyone to operate in a neuronormative way. We're then now doing one size fits all accommodations to get people to, operate in a neuronormative way. The ultimate goal is for them to operate in a neuronormative way. That's where we're falling down. That's still the ultimate goal. And just the idea of, like, this big thing in education of learning walks, just senior management turning up without any notice in classrooms saying, we want the culture where we can come in your classroom at any time. I don't know any other profession where that happens. Can you imagine we're having this, we're doing this podcast now and someone came in and go, yeah, I just want to make sure, I'm just checking to make sure that you're doing this podcast to an outstanding grade. You could be at any time they can come in. If I was having a meeting at work, the idea of someone just popping their head in and going, oh, hi, yeah, just dropped in to see if you're performing this meeting to an outstanding. Like, all of that pressure, all of that anxiety inducing for everyone. But if you're neuronormative, if you're neurodivergent and so for me, the structure and the planning, the idea of any change suddenly massively puts me, I can spin quite quickly if a change happens suddenly and I'm not expecting it. So it's all of those sort of things. There are other ways of doing things. There are other models of doing it. When I was doing my PhD, I spoke to one sixth form that they lent from this model. It's a Japanese model in which they didn't do lesson observations as in such, but what they would do is they would go into different areas, like they might go to the English department, they might go to social science, and they would immerse themselves. So that would be the area they'd be in for a week, and they'd have lunch with the staff and they'd have discussions and, asking their opinion. They'd sit round, and they would sit round in some of their classrooms, but they immersed themselves. It wasn't just, you can't just drop into something for 5 minutes and go, right, I can make a statement about the rest of that teacher's career for the rest of the year, So those sort of things. So I think practice policy needs to change for learners and for the workforce if we are really going to embrace neurodiversity. And to that, then all of the accountability measures, so how schools and colleges are accountable, that all needs to change. That doesn't need to change, but it needs to consider that if we're only focusing on output, such as how many percentage did you get students from who came in with a C to go up to an A, and it focuses on all of those performative outputs. While we're all focusing on all those performative outputs, those accountability measures, that is a juxtaposed at what the neurodiversity paradigm is talking about, in terms of affirming. And they could do both, or make it more neurodiversity affirming as best they could, and that's not what's happening for learners actually, or for learners are not my area of research, but I've worked in education, so I know, or the workforce themselves. So again, you're welcome, a very long answer.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's a lot to change in education. If it's going to be if it's going to recognise neurodiversity in its widest, then it needs to stop this one size fits all approach to everything.
How do you define a strengths-based approach to education and professional development, and how does it differ from deficit-based approaches?
Yeah, so I'm going to take an example. So if you look at in any staff room, so I take any teaching staff room, and if the department sat down and had that open discussion about, okay, what's our individual strengths as a team, and then as individuals, what do you like? Well, I'm really good at writing, like I said, doing all those synoptic things. I'm very good at creating the visual content for students. I used to do a lot of e-learning visual things as well for students. So I could do that, and then someone else goes, well, actually, I'm really good at. I love delivering revision sessions. I think I'm very good at being really focused to the criteria of the exam. Brilliant. Okay, so we share this division of labour. So not all teachers have to do the revision sessions. Not all teachers have to create all the visual content. Let's move away. And this exists more in schools than in colleges, where they go, right, okay, we have our resource of sociology. Every teacher has to use the same resources. We can't defer from the resources. You have to do them exactly, because those resources have been passed as of a standard, and that's it. Because you need to give people their freedom to be able to adapt it to the way they teach, how they process information. So that's the strength-based, really simple example of how you could do that. You sit down as a team. What are our strengths? Okay, brilliant. So what you do is like a inclusive division of labour. That's what it is. You're doing a division of labour between you. No one's doing more than anyone else, because you're working to each other's strengths. And then you come back together as a team, and then you can reflect on how it worked. And so that's what I used to do when I was a head of department in one of the colleges that I worked. And that's what I did. I used to do sessions on extension, aim higher for all students. I used to do things to get them to think outside of the box of sociology, to get them to think outside of the exam, because if they thought outside of the box, they would be able to fully understand sociology. So we'd look at wider factors. So you might, take something like at the time when we had the 2011, where we had, young people taken to the streets and saying they're not, not very happy, called, labelled as the riots, but, that they were. So we took that an example and looked at the wider context in terms of education, family, media, all of that. And so we used to take those examples. So I used to do that because I was very good at doing that. And then you can share your resources with your colleagues. They can still adapt it, just so I might use a slightly different example. And we had other colleagues that were used to like doing their exam sessions, and so they would deliver that. That's it. That's a really simple way of doing strength-based, because your strength-based is always going to be restricted by the nature of the business, if you're a teacher, and meeting those accountability measures, and always going to be restricted by the assessment criteria which is set by Ofqual. So if they've got to do exams, it doesn't matter how interactive you make your lessons, they're going to have to sit exams. So it may be. So I used to do mock exams with students. I used to say to them, you need to do this just so you can actually do the practical thing of sitting there for an hour and a half. That's a big ask. That's a big ask of any young person. A young person with ADHD, that might be an even greater ask, So just getting them to do things like that, and then thinking about how they could, emotionally prepare themselves for that. Those sort of things, they're your strength-based. So just take it from, it's not just about getting through the assessment. Let's think about the impact on the individual as a whole. The emotional, the psychological, that's how you do all of that. So that's my approach. And the reason why it's not, what we want to do is we want to keep it organic and evolving rather than prescriptive, because then we go down the route of the more kind of one size fits all thing. So we have to be creative, and all of those things are not something that's going to be extra resourceful. And in fact, they'll reduce resource, and people who then, teachers are working to their strengths, who are less likely to feel burnt out. I mean, teaching is a very, like every profession, requires a lot. But if people are allowed to work to their strengths within the confines of the business, then that's my answer to that.
How can educators and employers effectively communicate and reinforce a strength-based mindset among students, employees, and colleagues?
So they would start by encouraging those open discussions. They would start by acknowledging that they've got a neurodivergent, that their likelihood is that they have, I'm going to use the term in terms of population way of view, the correct way of view, that they recognise they've got a neurodiverse population of students and of the workforce. And so on their homepage, on their website, they recognise this, they acknowledge, they actually say, our student and staff workforce will be neurodiverse, which means that we will have the great spectrum of teachers who may have other neurotypes, such as they may be dyslexic, dyspraxic, and all of that one, and everything that they bring with that, another way of thinking, and talk about those strengths. I've said before, I've done examples of where you could have, because you'll go into schools, because I've been in schools where they will have a wall where it's like celebrities and famous people that are dyslexic or have got autism, and you're like, you don't need famous people. You've got role models in your school or college. You could be celebrating these individuals in a positive way. Celebrate them. And if you do that, that's how you change culture, because if you have it everywhere, it's no longer something that's othering. It means your whole culture is transparent. So if you had that on your website, in the classrooms, recognising, the great strengths, and look, I've actually got a little template of one that I set up for my training that I deliver, and it's like, this is your sociology teacher, Therese, and she has, she's been formally diagnosed dyslexic and dyspraxic, and what she, how, because of how she processes information, she's she's able to make, really synoptic links, and she's done these creative things and all of those things. So it's not about using, it's fine line between going into the, you mentioned before about that superpower, isn't this amazing? But what we're saying is we're focusing on the strengths. And what we're doing is that we're doing it in a way in which we're not using the language of, so they need to check their EDI policy. They need to check when they talk about reasonable adjustments, that they're not saying language that talks about fixing. Try and move away from language to do with condition, disorder. They can acknowledge and say something like, under the Equality Act, the protected characteristic is disability. So the language disability is associated with a biomedical model. And so our legal requirements are under, that protected characteristic. However, as a school, as a college, as a university, we embrace the neurodiversity approach to this, and we, X, Y, and Z, They can acknowledge, they don't have to, that's why you don't blur the two. So I've seen organisations where they talk about neurodiversity and then they start talking about neurodivergent conditions, and that's completely blurring the two things. And you don't talk about those two things. You acknowledge and you say, we're moving towards this, but our legal obligations use the biomedical language. And so therefore, when we talk about reasonable adjustments in place, that really is about getting people to the point in which they can perform the same as everyone else. What we want is, or the neuronormative, sorry, I should say, not everyone else. But what we want to do is the neurodiversity and affirming. So we will do things like, we're strength-based. So our teachers work to a strength-based. We plan our lessons around a strength-based. We plan our departments around a strength-based. So in any book, so if they've got any welcome to the, staff guide, staff handbook, student handbook, both of them talk about that they have a neurodiverse population of learners and workforce. They could have set up in every that there'll always be, I always joke about this, but it's true, in every school or college there will be a room full of where it's almost like a book grave where books go to die. So there'll be loads of books somewhere stuffed in a room. Clear that room out, make it a sensory room, or make it a quiet room, things like that. Because when I worked in FE, when I worked in an FE college, you could be sent all over the class, all over the building. And I still get, when I get anxiety, I've got this anxiety dream. It's based on reality. So I think I was in the college that I was working probably about 5 years at this point. So I knew the college inside out. They sent me teaching right over the other side, and it was a bit of a convoluted way. I got completely lost. I just couldn't find my way. And then once that happened, I got into a panic. Couldn't find, it was even asking people, but when you're in that spin and you ask someone directions, I couldn't recall anything. And so I was 10 minutes late to my class. And now whenever I'm anxious, I'll have a dream that I can't find a classroom. And so just again, timetable, so someone is on the same corridor. Like, really simple. Do you know, those sort of things? So that's how they do it. They put it in their policy. They embrace it in their culture. It's embedded in everything. That's how you do it. And also just that transparency of acknowledging that there are two main ways of approaching this. One is the kind of pathology paradigm. One is that, I mean, they don't have to go into loads of language. All they do is recognise that. Make the appraisal policy, make the disclosure. When you know you're being looked after, or that your employer wants to look after you. There was Neurodiversity in Business charity, you might have seen them on LinkedIn. They worked in conjunction with University of Birkbeck, and there was a big neurodiversity in business survey that went out last year. The results are out, and then they're doing it again this year in 2024. Now, one of the key things supports, it wasn't just in education, it was in all sectors. One of the key things that was said from that's always stayed from me from the report, is that for neurodivergent employees, the thing that was more important than reasonable adjustments for them was the fact that they felt psychological well-being and safe. Psychological safety is so important. So if someone feels that their employer has the very best intentions, but is confined within the business of education, and you know, as I said, policy is not decided upon by principals, you know, that the policy in the school and college, the college would be decided upon the principal, but they're very much shaped by wider national policy. So they don't always, but they do have responsibility to do what they can do to make things inclusive. If I knew that, I would feel, I've got to say where I'm working now, because I'm in paid employment as well. The managers that I've had, my line managers, have always been excellent at supporting me. But what we want to do is not have that responsibility just in the line managers. It has to be through every level of the organisation, you know? Definitely. And that's what's really important. It's everyone's responsibility, inclusion. And I think, yes, so then that would encourage individuals, should they wish to. I mean, that's the thing about neurodiversity and firming organisation. Once you get there, the need for reasonable adjustments or people to declare will be less. There may be individual ones that, specific ones to that individual they might need. I'm not saying let's do a one size fits all where we fixed all the reasonable adjustments either. But what I'm saying is, if you set up a situation, people may be less likely to have to ask for them. So for me, if I was put in a classroom where I knew that was my classroom, I didn't have to go in there, that would be an adjustment. I wouldn't have to ask, could I be timetabled in? You know, something like that. So yeah, that's my response. But it has to not come only from the schools and colleges and universities themselves. It has to become from the wider organisations that impact on the policy that those schools and colleges and universities do or put in place. Yeah.
Like, in the future, what opportunities and challenges do you foresee in further embracing strength-based approaches to support neurodiversity in education and the workplace?
So the challenges will be, and it comes back to, so the accountability measures that schools and colleges, not so much universities, but schools and colleges are kind of set by the Department of Education. Then you have the performance measures that are expected, that are overseen by Ofsted. So that's the agency that oversees the standards in education. So in schools and colleges, not universities, but in schools and colleges. Now, unless they acknowledge neurodiversity in the broadest sense, and consider that when they're coming up with policies, because I asked this in my research, even when they're coming up with the next criteria in terms of Ofsted for in conjunction with the Department of Education, in terms of how teachers are graded. So they've moved away from doing 1, 2, 3, 4, and now it's outstanding, good, requires improvement, and unsatisfactory. But it's still 1, 2, 3, 4. Everyone knows it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Just change you've just called the indicator something else. And so they will say, but when you set that criteria, when you set a framework, if you don't appreciate that you may have dyslexic, dyspraxic, teachers with PTSD, teachers that have epilepsy and everything else, if you don't appreciate those things when you're designing that structure, then when it comes to the colleges and schools putting practice in place, they're not going to pick up on it either, because they are going to be shaped by the accountability measures, and in terms of Ofqual to do with how we assess and the assessment. If they are not considering neuroinclusion, then that's the biggest challenge. We're always going to get so far. So you're going to get. Can you get a neuro ceiling? Can I say that? I've just made that word up. You're going to get, aren't you? You're going to get it. You're going to get so far, and you're not going to be able to go any higher, because if they're not changing anything and not appreciating, and I want someone from the Department of Education or Ofqual or anyway, or an officer to be great if they watch this, and I'd love them to challenge me and say, well, I don't think you appreciate this wider. You're right, I don't appreciate the wider, but if you know the wider, you can work with organisations such as that we're setting up there with Neurodiversity in Education to help you, to guide you through how you could join the two. Anyway, so that's a challenge. If anyone wants to approach me from the Department of Education, I'd be up for that. I think if those things stay the same, you are going to get that ceiling, that neuro ceiling. I've said it now, so it's out there. You're going to get that, or inclusion ceiling. Yeah, that's probably better. You're going to get that. You're never going to get any higher than that, because there's only so much that can be done. So that is the biggest challenge. So when I know this, because when I was doing my research, and I spoke to principals, and they go on training, I said, has anyone ever, when you've gone to training that Ofsted delivered about the new criteria or the new framework, has anyone ever spoken about teachers, neurodivergent workforce? Or when I said at the time, the language was like, that there might be specific teachers with specific learning differences. No, never mentioned, never raised. I actually interviewed a former policy officer for the Department of Education, and they said that they did do equality impact reports when they were coming up with policies, but not once did it ever consider the workforce. And even then, it would be more, when they did learners, they would be like, it would be more quantitative, like we need to make sure we increase girls in science or something like that, like be things like that. So it would be an EDI, but, very, well, it is an EDI, but, it's quite loose. It'll be about percentages and performative outputs, things they can measure. That's the problem with education. We're so obsessed with everything that we can measure, that everything else gets lost. And the irony is if we had from all sectors of education, so those, even though the policymakers, and if you had, Part of Education, the other organisations that are associated with education, the colleges, schools, the universities themselves, Ofqual, everyone, if they were all thinking about, and the teachers themselves and everyone involved, and they were all thinking about neuro inclusion and just approaching those little steps, examples I've given today. We're not talking about costing lots of money or big strides or anything like that. You would find that your workplace would be more effective. That's the irony. It would be more effective and more efficient. I hate using that language, but that's the language that they talk in business. people would be more efficient. If you feel safe, if your psychological well-being, if you're working in an environment which is strength-based, you're going to stay. One, you're going to stay, so retention goes up, and there's a massive problem in education at the moment in retention and recruitment. What we don't know is how many teachers are leaving who are identified as neurodivergent, whether being diagnosed, or not, with dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc., or have got PTSD, and then the wider, we don't know how many are leaving because they don't work in safe environments where they can declare. That's the issue. So that's the biggest challenge but that doesn't remove responsibility from us all to do what we can when we can do, that doesn't remove responsibility for us to do what we can now, just because we can't wait for that framework to change. That's, it's got to be a grassroots, it's got to be top down and bottom up, but in the absence, it has to be the schools and colleges need to take responsibility, and universities to do things. And also I would put throw my hat into the ring and say that there's probably, at this very moment, indirect discrimination and discrimination that's going on in schools and colleges to teachers who identify as neurodivergent, because the schools and colleges themselves and universities don't familiarise themselves or don't fully understand the implications of the Equality Act. Neither do they appreciate the specific requirements of the general duty and the specific duty of the public sector equality duty, which is part of the Equality Act. And because of that, they are probably breaking that law as we speak. But because it's like any piece of legislation, it's how it's policed, how it can be reported. If you want to report it, if you want to do something about it, you have to report to your union. You'd have to take out a grievance. You've got an employment tribunal. Gosh, it could take you 2-3 years to get to that point. That's a lot of stress, Yeah. So that's it. That's the biggest challenge. Yeah, it is a lot.